going to have a word of prayer and ask David if he wouldn't mind leading us in that prayer, and then we'll begin our study.
Our Father, we're thankful for this beautiful winter morning and for the opportunity we now have to study together for your word. We pray, Father, that you help each of us as students listen to the message from your word, and pray that you help build and direct our class this morning. We also pray for the ones that aren't able to be out today because of illness. Pray that you'll help them get stronger and we'll soon come back with us. We pray now that you'll be with us in our study. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Okay. Good morning, everyone. So we're in the last section of Matthew 6. If you'd like to turn your Bibles over there, we'll be in Matthew chapter 6 for this morning, and then the next few weeks we got, I think, about 4 more Sundays before the beginning of the spring quarter. We'll start and finish Matthew 7. So this last section of Matthew 6 is talking about worry, and Jesus connects it to money. And so this is the last part of his teaching on money. We've talked about it. He's talked about it through the last several verses. And so he concludes with this. Now, money is a difficult thing to talk about. It's something that we understand that is necessary in our world. But we also understand that it can bring a lot of anxiety to each person, and whether a person has a lot of it or whether a person doesn't have enough of it. It can bring a lot of problems within a person's mind and heart. And so Jesus is reminding us that rather than putting our trust and security in financial things, we need to make sure that we are relying on God. And so he tells us, first of all, there in Matthew, go back here, Matthew chapter 6, and he says, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of much more value than they? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his lifespan? And then we'll stop there for a moment, and we'll go back to verse 27 here in a few moments, or 28 rather, here in a few moments. But the first thing Jesus does is talks about our food and clothing and our lifespan. Now, those are things that people still are concerned about. There is talking about our lifespan. There's a large section of American history that I remember studying growing up, where a lot of the folks coming over, like the conquistadors, would come over to South America, and what was one thing that they were looking for? Do you remember? Fountain of Youth. Yeah, they felt that the Fountain of Youth would be in South America. Today, we still have folks, I'm not really looking for the Fountain of Youth, as far as I know. I mean, there might be somebody out there that's doing that, but there's a scientist, I don't remember his name. I don't know if he's a scientist or if he just hires scientists. I think that's what it is. He's a billionaire, and he is considered the most tested person on Earth in history, medically tested. And his goal is to extend his life, and he now claims, and you can buy some of his products that he claims will help anyone extend their life. He now claims that he is aging 6 months slower than the average person. I don't know if that's true. He was on a podcast not too long ago. I didn't listen to the entire interview, but he claims that his father was dying, and he was able to help him, and his son now takes the same things that he takes and is tested similarly to him. So that's still something that people talk about and are concerned with, extending their lifespans. There's a lot of things that could go on with that. Now, of course, this fella, he could be right. I don't know. He could be slowing down his aging process. But there's a lot more to life than just slowing down your aging process. You have to factor in other things that could take you out too. So he could be doing all of these things, spending all of this time and all of this money, and then ironically something horrible would happen to him in an accident, or he got a disease that he wasn't expecting. And so that kind of goes along with what Jesus is saying. You can't really add any time to your life. The Bible tells us that it's appointed for a man to die once, and then the judgment. So when we think about those things, yes, I'm not saying that we should go out there and just be haphazard with our health. We should not. But at the same time, that should not be the thing that consumes our thoughts. And the same thing is true with our food. Now, most of us are in a different situation than what people in the ancient times, and maybe even a large portion of society throughout the world is today. Our refrigerators are typically stocked. Our pantries are typically stocked. We have enough food for quite a while. But that's not the way it was in Jesus' time. That's not the way it is in much of the world. If you think about the developing nations, many of them in Africa and the Middle East, even the Americas, Asia, there's billions of people that don't know where they're going to get their next meal. And that's probably a little bit worse than what Jesus' situation, the situation with Jesus was. They had food, they just didn't have the abundance of food that we do. If we wanted to have meat for every meal, could we do that? Absolutely. And we could do it relatively cheap. But they couldn't. You might get meat, unless you were rich, you might get some meat once a month or something along those lines. Most folks, not by choice, had mainly a diet of vegetables. And in Jesus' area, of course, there was a lot of fishing going on. And so that would have been a staple of their diet, would have been fish. So there would have been protein there, but nothing like steak or of course, pork was definitely out of the question for people in Jesus' nation. I don't know if they ate chickens or not. I can't imagine not eating chicken, but that's just me. And then, of course, you've got clothing. Now, we're going to talk about that here, all of these things in more detail, but these three things, life, food, clothing, all together with money and finances, all of these are still things 2,000 years later that people are still very concerned with. Just think about our clothing. Our clothing now is not so much to keep us comfortable. Most people throughout history it is. I mean, if it's not going to be comfortable, I'm not going to wear it. But most folks, it was back in Jesus' time, he didn't have a lot of clothing. Again, we have closets full of clothing and shoes. And just about anything you could think of. There's probably clothes. I know there's clothes. I have my clothes that fit me now. I have my clothes that I'm hoping might fit me again later because I really liked them. But, I mean, when I'm honest with myself, I think that's probably going to wind up in Goodwill someday. But I have those, and then I have T-shirts that I hardly ever wear. I don't need them. I could probably have a yard sale or something. But clothing is still one of those things, and we go to the mall, we go to any store, and most of the places that you see are going to have clothes. Someone said, well, I don't like Levi. When I was a kid, it was Levi's or Lee's, I assume those companies are still around, but now you got Old Navy, you got, I don't know if Arrow's still a thing or not. You got different companies, and they're all about clothes. And you go to Penny, J.C. Penney, or what have you. There's clothes everywhere. Walmart sells clothes. We can get a hold of clothing. And so it's a little bit different than what it was in Jesus' time, when they didn't just have clothing stores on every corner and down the street. So they were more concerned about clothing for another specific purpose. A lot of us are concerned with clothing in our generation. I don't mean us in this building. A lot of folks are concerned with clothing in our last few generations because they want to look cool. You know, is that going to make me look, am I going to be unpopular if I wear this? When I was in the 7th grade, I didn't have any Nike Air Jordans, but they had these other ones, Nike Airs. So it was like a step down from Air Jordan, I think. I loved those shoes. For one thing, they were black, white, and turquoise. And turquoise is one of my favorite colors. I had Converse turquoise. I had a BMX turquoise with white tires. Anything turquoise, I liked. So I like these shoes. Well, guess what? In my 8th grade year, I found the exact same pair. They were comfortable. I liked the way they looked. So I told Mom and Dad, I'll just get this pair again. I didn't know people were going to make fun of me for wearing the same shoes. I didn't even know people were going to notice that I had the same shoes on 2 years in a row. But you know what? They did. And they made fun of me for it. But I still wore them. I didn't care. I wasn't about to go ask Mom and Dad to give me another pair of shoes just because someone thought it was funny that I was wearing the same kind. But that shows us that people put a lot of emphasis on that. Now, in Jesus' time, and probably a lot of areas around the world still, just not here, if you don't have clothes, what's the problem? You're going to be naked. So yeah, people are going to be concerned about clothing. That's a different take on it, but we still see they have reasons, we have reasons. Their reasons are probably a little more valid than us wanting to look cool for our friends, but those are still reasons. Jesus says, don't worry about that stuff. Don't worry about it. So the first thing he tells us to do, he gives us advice, is to be a bird watcher. I know some of you enjoy birds. I also love birds. And I like this passage because of the fact that I do enjoy watching birds. But Jesus tells us to watch the birds, consider the birds. Let's see. For one thing, let's think about birds for a couple of moments. They just live their lives. You know, that I don't know that they ever worry about a cat or a hawk coming down and getting them, or a cat jumping up and grabbing them. If it happens, it happens. You know, they don't have the capacity in their mind probably to be concerned about that from moment to moment. Of course, if one comes after them, they're gonna try to fight and survive. But typically, they're just living their lives. They're not worried about where they're going to find their food. Now, Jesus isn't telling us not to prepare and not to go looking for food, because food's just not going to come out of the sky. I mean, that happened once for 40 years for the Israelites, a very specific time for a very specific purpose. It's not going to happen. Jesus isn't telling people to be lazy and just expect food to just pop up out of nowhere. There might be people that will do that for someone, but that's not what he's saying. Because if you think about it, what are two of the things that birds are usually going to be doing? Number one, here, hopefully in a few weeks, we're going to start seeing robins. And they're going to, what I love about robins, I don't know if this is what they're doing or not, but I know they're looking for food. They're looking for earthworms, and every time when they're getting close, what do? They tilt their head. Now, to me, that looks like they're listening, but they do have eyes on the side of their head, so maybe they're looking. I don't know. But I love watching them do that. But birds are typically going to be looking for food. If you feed birds, if you have bird feeders bringing in all the different types of birds, they're flying around, they're looking for food. It's provided for them. They don't have to plant a garden. They don't have to put seeds in the ground or anything like that. The food's provided for them. But they have to go look for it. Or what's another thing that birds do, especially at the beginning of the spring season? They're building a nest. They're looking for things to build their nest out of. So they are at work, but those things are provided for them. God provides those things for them. And so Jesus is reminding us here that these little birds, which are important, in fact, everything that God created is important, not just because he created them, but also because they are important to our environment. But they are important, but they're not as important as we are. You see, that's a thing that the world gets backwards right now. I hear sometimes folks say things like, human beings are the virus, and the world would be so much better off, or the earth would be so much better off if we weren't here. The earth would be probably better off if some folks would start acting better. But without human beings, everything starts to get very wild. And that's not good. Sometimes we get things backwards and we mess things up worse. But God created us in order to rule over the earth, not to destroy things and to make it submit to our will like a tyrant, but as God would rule over it, to take care of it and to help it to help us, that sort of thing, as we see there in Genesis chapters 1 through 3. We're much more of value than the birds are because we are made in God's image. We have eternal souls. Jesus died on the cross for us. Now, when Jesus is saying this is prior to those things. He's telling folks that this is what's going to happen. The prophets have been leading up to that, even though no one's really caught it. But what we have here is Jesus is telling us, he's reminding us, you as a human being are far more important than a little bird. And God provides for the birds, so how much more is he going to provide for you and your needs? And of course, the same thing is true as we keep on going down through. Now, I want us to go to Proverbs chapter 24 before we move on. But let's go to Proverbs 24, and then we'll move on from there. Jesus is not contradicting anything or anyone. There are times that people will look at this and say, well, I just don't think that we should be doing anything. God will provide, and that's true, but we also have to realize, how does God provide as well? There are things out there. Everything that we have, everything that we make is there because God made it. I saw a joke not too long ago, as you're turning to Proverbs 24. I saw a joke where this fella speaks up to God and he says, God, we can make people just like you did. And God says, is that right? Show me. And so the man says, well, we can take some of this dirt just like you did. And God says, no. Get your own dirt. That dirt's mine. You see, everything that's here is here because God put it here. We're able to do things with it. I don't think we can make people out of dirt. That was just the funny part of the joke. But we were able to do things with it, but if it weren't for God providing those raw materials, we have nothing. So it all goes back to God. Jesus is not telling us not to prepare, not to do the things. In fact, Paul tells us in the Thessalonian letters, because some folks had stopped working, preparing for the second coming of Christ, thinking he's going to be here any moment. So they quit their jobs, and Paul says what? Really, he says, get back to work. If you don't work, you don't what? You don't eat. So get back to work. And he's not contradicting Jesus. Jesus isn't contradicting Paul. We have to balance that out. We don't want people to go around thinking that's what's going on. Well, in Proverbs chapter 24, verses 30 through 34, it says, I passed by the field of a sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense, and behold, it was all overgrown with thorns, and ground was covered with nettles, and a stone wall was broken down. Then I saw and considered it. I looked and received instruction, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. Jesus is not telling us to be a sluggard. But what he is telling us is these things, the food that you need to have, God knows you need it. That doesn't need to, don't let that consume every thought that you have. It's not easy sometimes, especially in Jesus' time, or when you're thinking of folks in torn areas that have very little food. God knows what you need, and he says he'll provide that for you. Now, when it comes to clothing, he says, consider the flowers. Again, flowers are in trees, especially in springtime, the ones that bloom, the dogwoods and the tulips that come up, and daffodils that start to come up first. All of these things, beautiful to look at. You think about all of these flowers, and even leaves. Honestly, West Virginia to me is a very beautiful place up until about November, and then the leaves are gone. And honestly, it's kind of ugly. When the leaves fall off, it's just an ugly place. Now, it's not been too bad in January. It's pretty with the snow. But God brings beauty to the earth. And we're very blessed that we live in an area that has so much beauty to it. Not every place on earth does. You have deserts and places that are very cold that don't have the beauty that we enjoy. God brings beauty to something that really he didn't need to do. Think about that for a second. A lot of scientists, evolutionists, I'll say, come up with ideas. Why are things so pretty? Why are things so beautiful? And their idea is, well, it had to be beautiful in order to. The flowers have to be beautiful in order to attract the bees and the other pollinators. Some of them say that. Some of them say they're not really beautiful. It's just our perception of them because of the feelings that we have for spring and summer that makes them beautiful. Because beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So there's a lot of things people try to throw out there to take away credit from God and to take away credit from those things which are beautiful. He didn't need to do all that. He could have very easily made things less appealing to the eye and everything would have been okay. It's kind of like when we think about food. We don't typically just like to eat mush. Now, if the mush has everything you need in it, you'll be fine. But who wants to eat that? That's disturbing. Doesn't feel right, doesn't taste right. I don't want that. So we like to have things that are excellent, things that make you enjoy life. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, if we go on and think, this is all I have to do, I just want to enjoy my life all the time with these things, then that gets into another problem. We're starting to worship and to desire the creation over the Creator. But rather, when we see these beautiful things, we see the birds, and we eat the food that we enjoy, it should, instead of making us long for the creature and the creation, be thankful to the Creator for his imagination and the things that he's given us, and the things that we're able to see. Otherwise, you think about these flowers, a field would just be a field. But God has given it beauty. And so Jesus says, don't worry about your clothes, what you're going to wear. Let's go ahead and read that now. In verse 28, it says, and why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. And yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But, this is where the connection needs to be made. If God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown in the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? So, we live in an age, as it says up there on the board, we live in an age of fast fashion, disposable clothing. They didn't do that then. You would have clothing that hopefully is going to last you for a pretty long time. And if you get a tear in it, what would they typically do? Jesus has a parable about it, doesn't he? You're going to sew a patch on it. Because you just can't go out and get yourself new clothes at every whip stitch. I remember when I was younger, we would patch up holes in our clothes. Or if the hole was bad enough and you were wearing jeans, what would you do? Cut them off. They work as shorts now, right? But now, thank you, Walmart. I got a little hole in my pants. Well, I'm just going to go down here and buy another pair. You know? Throwaway clothing. Fast fashion. They didn't have that in that time. And so, when we think about Jesus, how much clothing did Jesus have? Just the one. And of course, it was gambled for at the cross. So again, God's not saying don't. I didn't put that on the board. I'm sorry. Don't walk around and just expect clothing to fall out of the air. You got to do things to get it, but don't let that consume your imagination. And sometimes folks do. And so really what this is about is more about faith and trust in God. And really that's what faith is trusting in God. When you hear folks say, they have this idea that faith is just believing something, that's not what biblical faith is at all. A lot of people believe things. We all believe things. It doesn't mean that I have faith in them. I believe things. I'm not talking biblically speaking here. I'm sure I believe things that you don't believe, and you probably believe things that I don't believe when it comes to things that people say or historical facts that we're given from different resources or just different things out there. There's different things that we all believe. I don't have faith in any of that stuff. None of that stuff's going to save me. Maybe sometimes it's interesting to think about and to mull over in my mind, but I don't trust in it. I don't have faith in it. I just believe it. So a lot of people think that there's this belief. Okay, so do you believe in God? And what people hear is, if they say, do I believe in God, does that mean, do I believe that God exists? That's not what the Bible is wanting us to pick up on. In fact, when you open up the Bible in Genesis chapter 1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It doesn't say, in the beginning, it appears that everything was intelligently designed, and then makes its argument as to why God did it. It just opens up and it assumes that when you look at creation, you're going to say, God did this. And the Bible's confirming that. God created the heavens and the earth. Nowhere in the Bible does God waste the time to try to convince people that he exists. Most people throughout history is going to believe that there is a God. They may not believe in the right one, but they're going to believe that someone out there has done all of this. People still do this today. They might believe in evolution, or they'll say they believe in evolution, but I've noticed over the last 10 years or so, it's become really popular, especially on television shows, and unfortunately, that has an influence and impact on the way folks think. If something happens that cannot be explained, they oftentimes will say, the universe must have wanted this. Well, they're using the word universe as a synonym for what? God. You can't trick us, but you're just not giving the glory to God. You're giving the glory to the creation rather than the creator. God created the universe. And if you've ever watched Star Trek, you'll know how Dr. Bones feels about outer space and the universe. It's a cold place full of disease and danger. That's what the universe is like, because we live in a fallen creation. And really, that's what the world has become outside of Christ. A fallen creation, full of danger. But that's not because of God's influence. It's because of what sin has brought to it. So when someone says, do you believe in God? It's not, do I believe that God exists? It's, do I believe in him? Do I trust in him to save me, to provide for me and my family? That's where the trust, that's where the belief comes in. That's biblical belief. And so that's what this is all about. And a lot of times folks will, there does seem to be that dichotomy, belief in God, trust in God, finding security in God, or on the other hand, finding security in money and finances. And those are two things are going to be at odds. Again, money, security, all of that's important, but it must not consume the Christian's thoughts. And rather it being our master, it must be our servant, that it may serve our master and give him glory. And so really when you think about it, if we put our faith in money or anything else, we're not really putting our faith in money, but we're putting our faith in who? In ourselves. And how well can we provide? How well can we save ourselves? We can't. Because at the end, no matter how much money we have, no matter how many toys we have, it all goes back to somebody else because we're not going to be able to take it with us. It's going to go to family members or the government's going to get it. So that's why Jesus goes back. You go back and see what Jesus says, and he says, rather than investing in worldly things, we ought to invest in what? Heavenly things. Those are things that are not going to rust, and people aren't going to come in and steal, and moths are not going to come in and eat your clothes, that sort of thing. So it's really about faith in God, faith and trust and security. Where are we going to find that? Again, Jesus is not naive. He knows, in fact, he says right here, he knows our days are full of trouble. Let's see here. The very last sentence of this section. Therefore, in verse 34, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. But again, our days are going to have trouble. It's just the way the world is. Someone's going to cause trouble for us. It might be someone that you know personally. It might be someone that you have they don't know you from Adam to them. You're just a number, but they're going to cause some problems because something you did or did not do correctly, and their forms are messed up. And so they're going to call you, they're going to email you, they're going to harass you until it's fixed. That's trouble. Sometimes you go to the doctor and you find out you have trouble. I mean, it's all around. But Jesus doesn't want us to be consumed just with that. He wants us to be consumed rather with God. Okay, we've already talked about the rest of that on that one. So he tells us not to be anxious there. Now, the word for anxious, I wanted to bring this up. The word for anxious, if you see it on the screen behind me, is pronounced in the Greek suke. So this is where we get the word for psyche. Make sure I get the right thing here. Self, not anxious. That's the word for self. Psyche, suke. And that's also where we get psyche in our world, psychology, psychiatrist. Sometimes in the Bible it's translated as soul. And really what it means is your entire life. In other words, we've talked about this recently, your wholeness. The Jewish people, the Bible was very concerned about being whole. It also talks about perfect, and that's what it means when it's talking about perfect. It's not being sinless, it's being whole. And we see that because a perfect week, my idea of a perfect week is getting everything done that needs to be done at a pretty decent time of the week, making sure I drink coffee. When I get home, I have the time to get in my pajamas and robe and sit down and drink some coffee for a little bit before I go to bed. That's my perfect idea for a good week. But that's not what it means. A perfect week means 7 days. It's a whole week. A whole year is 365 and a quarter days. That's complete. It's whole. So to be whole, the Bible is concerned about your entire being, your mind. And by the way, when Jesus says in Matthew, I believe 22, when he's asked, what is the greatest commandments? He says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. In other words, he's saying what? Love God with everything you are, everything you have. Love God that way. And the implication, therefore, is if you love God with everything you are, that makes you whole. That makes you complete. And then, of course, the second commandment is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, if you love God the way you ought to love God, what's your relationship going to be with other people? You're going to love them too. They're connected. See, and then you go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 12, and in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 is the preacher, as he calls himself, is concluding the thoughts of that book. He says, the whole of man, says the conclusion of the matter. He says, the whole duty of man. Now, I want to stop there for a second. A lot of times in our newer translations in the last 20 or 30 years, they stopped doing this, some of them. I don't know why. But there are times in the English translations where you see a word that is italicized. We may have spoken about this not too long ago. And so a word that's italicized in our books or articles means that the author is emphasizing that word. However, in the Bible, it simply means that the interpreters, the translators, felt that because Hebrew or Greek, but especially in the Old Testament, Hebrew is not as easily translated into English as other languages are. So sometimes you have to put a word in here and there in order to make it flow. And so you'll notice in some of the older ones, I think the King James still does this, that the word duty is italicized, meaning that the translators added it there because they felt that it was what the author meant. Most of the time, I will agree with the interpreters and the translators. This is one of those times that I do not. And the reason for that is because of the idea of completeness and wholeness in Jewish thought and biblical thought. So if you take away the word duty, which was added there by the interpreters and the translators, I should say, it says, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man. In other words, what he's saying is, if you fear God and keep his commandments, this makes you a complete person, a whole person. There are a couple other times that happens, that they add words in there thinking that will help make it sound better in English. For example, in the book of John, this is kind of out of the way, I just want to give you an example. In the book of John, Jesus is being arrested in the garden there, and he says, who do you seek? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus responds by saying, I am he. And what happens to everyone who was coming to arrest Jesus? They fall over, fall down face first. The thing is, the word he is italicized, meaning that the original Greek simply says, I'm going to translate it, simply says when Jesus says, who do you seek? They say, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus simply says, I am. Now that means a lot different in biblical thought than just saying, I am he. Because the phrase I am is what? That's the name of God. Yeah. And of course they fall over. That makes sense. They can't stand in the presence of the I am unless he allows them to. Because later on, they get back up. He says, who are you seeking? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. He said, I told you I am. This time they don't fall over. Why? The implication there is because he's allowing them to stand. So there are times that they are wanting to have that flow a little bit better. It's not that they're trying to hide things. That's why they italicized it. And that way you can look at it and see how it should be, how you believe that it should be interpreted. Those are just a couple of instances. Anyhow, let's get back to the psyche, suki type of stuff. What does it mean not to be anxious? So in our world, the word anxious comes pretty loaded because we talk about anxiety. And so when we look at this and we think about anxiety, Jesus says, don't be anxious. This is a difficult thing to think about, but is that the first bell? Okay. So anxiety is actually, now, we use it a little bit different. It's usually concerning something when it comes to mental health. We're doing better about talking about those things. We're still not quite there. That is something that is real, and it is something that we need to be concerned with. The actual word is merimneo, which is a Greek word that usually is translated to be worried, to be concerned, or to give thought to. I have on the board here some different ways, different translations. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 32, you can read about that, and Paul talks about having care. The English Standard Version does typically translate it with anxiety or anxious. Christian Standard will translate it as concerns. New King James and American Standard does not do it that way. In New King James, in 1 Corinthians 12:25, the same word comes up, and this time the English Standard Version agrees with the New King James and ASV, care. Christian Standard, concerns. It's the one that's going to keep that going. 2 Corinthians 11:28, the word pops back up. New King James, concern. ASV and ESV, anxiety. Christian Standard, concern. There's just a few different ideas. Some other examples that we get the ideas from, we get what it's talking about. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. It says, cast your cares. I love the way the King James Version says this. Cast your cares upon him, for he cares for you. Same word there. Of course, God's not going to have anxiety, but he does care. So it's giving thought to. Matthew chapter 13, verse 22 talks about worry. Worry can choke you out like a weed. And so we don't want to be worried about things, but rather put our faith in God. Being concerned about things, that's good. We need to be concerned about things. Worrying about things, not so much. I was a kid, I was such a worrywart. I mean, if I didn't feed my dog through the day, and sometimes I wouldn't, guess who ended up feeding my dog late at night? My mom. I'd feel so bad about that. I didn't feel bad enough to always do it, obviously, but I would feel bad about that. And we had an outside dog, and he was outside behind my window. I don't know if Mom knows this or not. She's going to know when she listens to this. I would go to my window, and I would watch to make sure she didn't fall into the septic tank. Now, that sounds weird, doesn't it? But my dad was always telling me, don't go in this section of the yard in case the septic tank collapses. So I was always afraid if Mom falls in the septic tank, that's my fault. And then we had a lot of corn over in the side yard. And I knew very well that there could be anything out there. There could be a bear out there. There could be a person out there. There could be aliens in that corn for all I knew. I'd worry myself to death. Well, every time she always came back. I'd go to sleep, and we used to have a little airport in Mineral Wells where people would fly their little planes, and they would come around our house, and they would do their little stunts. They would go up, and then they would just kind of fall down a little bit to the earth, and then they would pick it back up. It would scare me to death. So I would always imagine that somebody's going to mess up when they're doing their tricks at nighttime. Just a kid, didn't think things through. I figured that one of those planes was going to wind up through my window. Scared me to death. I worried about everything. And as I got older, I continued to worry. It's been a struggle. Now that I am older, I don't worry that much. But some of us are worry warts, and Jesus would not want us to do that. It steals our life and our joy. That's about all we have time for today. We can go through quite a bit more, but we won't. Does anyone have any questions or comments or insights before we dismiss for services? Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah. That's a good point, Tom. I mean, he might be living longer, but is he really living his life? Is that what you mean by that? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a good point. Okay. Well, thank you all very much.